Sharp has resigned. It follows an investigation into his part in facilitating an £800,000 loan guarantee to the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. The publication of that report is expected imminently. Mr Sharp made this statement a few moments ago.
Good morning. I would like to thank Adam Heppenstall and his team for the diligence and professionalism they have shown in compiling today's report. Mr Heppenstall's view is that while I did breach the governance code for public appointments, he states very clearly that a breach does not necessarily invalidate an appointment. Indeed, I've always maintained the breach was inadvertent and not material, which the facts he lays out substantiate. The Secretary of State has consulted with the BBC board, who support that view. Nevertheless, I have decided that it is right to prioritise the interest of the BBC. I feel that this matter may well be a distraction from the corporation's good work were I to remain in post until the end of my term. I have, therefore, this morning, resigned as the BBC chair to the Secretary of State and to the board. It was proposed to me that I stay on as chair until the end of June, while the process to appoint my successor is undertaken, and I will, of course, do that in the interests of the corporation's stability and continuity. Let me turn to the events that are subject of today's report. When I sought in December 2020 to introduce the Cabinet Secretary to Mr Blythe, I did so in good faith. I did so with the best of intentions, and I did so with the sole purpose of ensuring that all relevant rules were being followed. I am pleased that Mr Heppenstall supports the fact that my involvement in these matters, as he states, was accordingly very limited. After extensive work, he states, his words, that he is happy to record that he has seen no evidence, and nor could he, to say I played any part whatsoever in facilitation, arrangement, or financing of a loan to the former Prime Minister. Now, during my conversation with the Cabinet Secretary on December the 4th, 2020, I reminded him of the fact that I was in the BBC appointment process. I believed, as a result of that conversation, that I had been removed from any conflict or perception of conflict. I understood this recusal to be absolute. This was my error. In my subsequent interview with the appointments panel, I wish, with the benefit of hindsight, this potential perceived conflict of interest was something I'd considered to mention. I would like once again to apologise for that oversight, inadvertent though it was, and for the distraction these events have caused the BBC. For more than 20 years, I've devoted time and energy to public service, whether at the Institute of Cancer Research, at the Royal Academy of Arts, on the Financial Policy Committee of the Bank of England, or as an economic advisor to the Treasury working up to protect British business, including the creative industries, during the pandemic. And for more than 2 years now, I've seen the beating heart of the BBC up close. And for all its complexities, successes, and occasional failings, the BBC is an incredible, dynamic, and world-beating creative force, unmatched anywhere. As chair, I have acted at all times in the public interest and for the betterment of the BBC. I'm proud to have fought for the recent return of government funding for the World Service. I've been active in commissioning independent thematic reviews of BBC coverage on touchstone issues, and I've championed the importance of the BBC as a well-funded and impartial public service broadcaster. To chair this incredible organisation has been an honour. The BBC's contribution to our national life is immense. Its people are hard-working and absolutely brilliant, and preserving and enhancing it really matters. Thank you.
So that was a statement from Richard Sharp, the outgoing chairman of the BBC. He has resigned in the last few minutes. That follows an investigation by Adam Heppenstall, KC, that suggested that he potentially breached the regulations regarding his appointment as chairman of the BBC because of his facilitation of a loan guarantee to the former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. We can go now to Westminster. Our political correspondent, Joe Pike, is there. Joe, the report has just been published. I mean, the key point that Richard Sharp was emphasising there is that this was a potential breach rather than an actual breach.
But nonetheless, Ian, it was a breach of the code. Adam Heppenstall making it clear that Richard Sharp should have mentioned that conflict of interest. He should have mentioned it in his report, and towards the bottom, Mr Heppenstall writes, Mr Sharp should have made the disclosure set out in this key findings section. Ultimately, the BBC chairman has jumped before, I think, pressure built, which would have led to him ultimately being pushed. There were two ways out of this. One, he could have resigned. The procedure for removing a BBC chair involved the Secretary of State for Culture consulting with the BBC board. Ultimately, I suppose Rishi Sunak might have been the decision maker, telling his Secretary of State what to do. That would have been ugly. You know, we're likely to get a reaction in the coming minutes to that report from the Labour Party, from opposition parties, and from MPs on the Culture Select Committee. Remember, that Select Committee has already been incredibly critical of Mr Sharp, saying that he breached the standards expected, that this was a significant error of judgment. Therefore, I think it was the recognition of Mr Sharp that it would have been too difficult to stay on. And as he said in that statement, it would have really damaged the BBC's reputation, which already has been battered by a number of rows, including the Gary Lineker row. But this has been swirling around for a number of months, and clearly is not good for the corporation. Ultimately, the fact that Richard Sharp didn't tell either the Culture Committee when he gave evidence, or the appointment panel when applying for the job, about his role in facilitating this loan did for him. Now, he argues, as he explained in that statement, that Mr Heppenstall agrees he didn't play a key role in any role in facilitating, arranging or financing the loan to Boris Johnson. And allies of Mr Sharp I've spoken to have said that it is agreed that he did not know until it appeared later in the he was asked about this by journalists, that there would be a loan or loan guarantee. But of course, he did have contact with Sam Blythe, then went to the Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case. That was, Mr Heppenstall argues, a conflict of interest he should have mentioned when applying for this very senior, a high-paid job on a pretty high salary, £160,000 a year, and therefore he has decided to go. Now, Ian, what happens next? Well, he is going to remain in position until a replacement is found, so he's going to be in position for a few more months. But clearly a very embarrassing episode for Mr Sharp. Also, I think perhaps his decision today saves Rishi Sunak from having to make a difficult decision. We know the Prime Minister is appearing later today in Scotland and Wales at party conferences, the Scottish Conservative Party conference and the Welsh Conservatives Party conference, likely, I'm sure, to be asked about this. But the fact that Mr Sharp has acted and acted fast, doing that statement, recording that statement with the BBC, even before the report was released to all of us, I think has saved Rishi Sunak some difficult questions, and he argues, Mr Sharp argues, it saves also the BBC from more difficult, painful headlines. He said that what he did was with the best of intentions. He claims there's no evidence he played any part in the facilitation, arrangement or financing of that loan to Boris Johnson, but also there was regret there. He regretted, as he said, that he hadn't mentioned this to the panel and to the Culture Select Committee. He apologised to BBC staff for the distraction he has been in recent weeks, and now his time as BBC chair is coming to an end. He's acted quickly, Ian, but I suppose critics of Mr Sharp would argue he should have acted many months ago. This report has dragged the story out unnecessarily long, and therefore he has caused yet more damage to the organisation, the corporation that he should have been standing up for and prioritising in his job as chairman.
Joe, what really strikes me as being very interesting in all of this, looking again at the statement from Richard Sharp announcing his resignation a few moments ago, is that he stresses that Adam Heppenstall found that his breach was inadvertent and not material. And actually, the BBC board appears to have come to that conclusion. So it sounds very much as though Richard Sharp retained the backing of the BBC board.
Certainly allies, Ian, of Mr Sharp have said in recent days that there are people on the BBC board who are very supportive of his contribution. On that fact of a breach of the appointments code, it is clear, and Mr. Sharp recognised even before this report was out, that he had breached the code. And as you say, the sort of judgment of Mr. Heppenstall was how bad was that breach? Was it material breach? Was it an inadvertent breach? Of course, Mr. Sharp argued it and has argued it was inadvertent. He clearly does have some supporters on the BBC board, and there are certain media reports today that senior BBC management, some senior BBC management, are publicly very supportive of the role he has played. Of course, what the BBC have now with Mr. Sharp is somebody who is pretty supportive of their needing more funding, but also can communicate with Rishi Sunak well because he used to work for him at Goldman Sachs. He is, some people within the BBC argue, an effective communicator, an effective lobbyist towards Mr. Sunak. But ultimately, the bad headlines, Ian, he has created in recent weeks, hanging on to his job, as Mr. Heppenstall has been compiling this report, has been damaging to the corporation. And that, I think, is ultimately why he's decided that if he hadn't resigned now, and he'd have created even worse headlines, and that would have been, damaging to the BBC for a number of days, potentially. And therefore he's decided to jump before he potentially was pushed.
OK, thanks, Joe, for that. Well, joining me now on the telephone is Professor Tim Luckhurst. He's principal of Durham University's South College, and he is, of course, a former editor of news programmes at BBC Scotland. Tim Luckhurst, your reaction, please.
Well, the BBC has lost a Conservative chairman who was probably more friendly to the BBC than many other Conservatives. The circumstances in which Richard Sharp has resigned are, of course, ones for which he is responsible, and he's taken responsibility for his error and quit at this stage. But I think the BBC now faces a challenge. As you recognise, Richard Sharp is regarded inside the BBC as a very competent and supportive chairman. And given that any Conservative government is going to appoint a Conservative to chair the BBC will be wondering whether they're going to get somebody who is as competent, as supportive and as passionate about the BBC as Richard Sharp clearly has been.
Tim, I'm struck by, the people say that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Of course, the BBC was in this position 19 years ago when another former chairman, who was also an ex-Goldman Sachs executive, Gavin Davis, resigned over the BBC's coverage of the Iraq War. What is this going to do for morale inside the BBC?
That'll be a major challenge for BBC management, and I'm sure that they're conscious of it. As you say, they have had previous experience of such resignations and of such controversy. It's important to note, of course, that the chairman isn't a hands-on editorial figure, rather a supporter, a guide, an advisor to senior BBC executives. And in that sense, they will be in a good position to move forward. But staff do need reassurance. The BBC's rarely been under as much pressure as it currently is under, and in the sense that he was a Conservative who understood the purpose of the licence fee, understood the value of the BBC as a public service broadcaster, I know that there will be anxiety amongst BBC staff about what happens in future and about whether they could really expect to get someone with a similar set of sympathies to replace Richard Sharp as their chairman.
Well, I think that's a really, really good point you've made there. In terms of someone who could fight the BBC's corner, particularly with all sorts of questions over the BBC's funding, you couldn't really have got someone better than Richard Sharp, who knows the highways and byways of the finance sector really well. And as you say, Rishi Sunak used to work for him.
That's absolutely right. And of course, to get someone in politics who is well connected in the Conservative Party and also sympathetic to the corporation is a very big challenge. After all, there are not many in politics, and certainly few in the Conservative Party, who are really familiar with the broadcast sector and who really have sympathy for the public sector broadcasting ideals. He's not the only one. There are others, but many of them are people who are currently doing rather serious jobs and working full-time in other positions. So this is going to be a big challenge, and it will be very interesting to see how quickly the government goes about replacing Mr. Sharp, because it is, after all, a prime ministerial decision, and how carefully they do it. And will they privilege the interests of the Conservative Party or seek to balance the interests of the Conservative Party with the interests of the BBC? At a time when a general election is looming, that's a crucial question.
Kirst, greatly appreciate you joining me this morning. Thank you very much indeed. This story obviously developing by the minute. The BBC board has just issued the following statement. Let me read that to you. The BBC board statement says, "We accept and understand Richard's decision to stand down. We want to put on record our thanks to Richard, who has been a valued and respected colleague and a very effective chairman of the BBC. The BBC board believes that Richard Sharp is a person of integrity. Richard has been a real advocate for the BBC, its mission, and why the corporation is a priceless asset for the country at home and abroad. He has always had the impartiality of the BBC and a desire to see the organisation thrive at the forefront of his work as chairman. We understand that the UK government is moving swiftly to begin the process of appointing a new chairman of the BBC in line with the terms of the BBC's charter." So there you go. Very interesting indeed. I mean, that really reiterates what I was saying to Joe Pike a couple of moments ago, which was that the BBC board was clearly behind its chairman, but he's obviously decided for reasons of maintaining, keeping the focus off the BBC, he has decided to go. Well, we can get further reaction now from Ali Fortescue, who is in Westminster. Now, Ali, you've been having a look at the report from Adam Heptinstall. What's in it?
Yeah, well, we know that Richard Sharp has decided to go, but obviously we are still looking through the detail. This is the report. It's just landed. It's about 25 pages long. And if I take you to the second page, here you go. He says, the successful candidate, Mr. Richard Sharp, failed to disclose a potential perceived conflicts of interest to the panel. So that is right at the heart of this. This was what this was looking at, that loan guarantee between that Richard Sharp helped the former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, get. And you see here, Mr. Sharp informed the Prime Minister that he wished to be chair of the BBC board. That is crucial, not something I'm sure that we knew before. And then it goes on to say, you can see at the bottom, 2.3, these matters gave rise to a potential perceived conflict of interest. There is a risk of a perception that Mr. Sharp was recommended for appointment because he assisted the former Prime Minister in a private financial matter and or he influenced the former Prime Minister to recommend him by informing him of his application before he submitted it. There may well have been a risk for a perception that Mr. Sharp would not be independent from the former Prime Minister. So that goes right to the heart of this, a breach of the governance code. There you go, in the report by Adam Heptinstall KC. A breach of the governance code does not invalidate an appointment, he goes on to say. And this is what Richard Sharp was mentioning in that statement you heard from him there. He was keen to say that he didn't necessarily have to go because a governance code does not invalidate an appointment, but because there is a breach of the governance code, and I think the sense you get is that the BBC chairman does not want to be someone who is in the headlines. He obviously is all about keeping the impartiality, the perceived impartiality of the BBC. So he clearly felt it was time to go. That is the big news this morning, but we're obviously getting into the detail, this 25-page report that has just landed, Ian, and here you clearly see the former Prime Minister in a private financial matter and or that he influenced former Prime Minister to recommend him by informing him of his application before he submitted it. That is absolutely crucial to this.
All right, thanks, Ali. Still getting reaction right now. Just to update you, the chairman of the BBC, Richard Sharp, has resigned during the last 15 minutes. This follows the publication of a report by Adam Heptinstall KC into his involvement in the facilitation of a loan guarantee to the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, which was not disclosed at the time that he was going through the appointment process to become chairman of the BBC. We've got a letter that I can read you now from the Culture Secretary, Lucy Fraser. This is to Richard Sharp, and the letter says, "Thank you for your letter notifying me of your decision to resign from your position as chair of the British Broadcasting Corporation. I understand and respect your decision to stand down. As you have stated, the BBC is a great national institution. Over the past 100 years, it has touched the lives of almost everyone in the United Kingdom and plays a unique part in our cultural heritage. It is respected globally, reaching hundreds of millions of people across the world every week. No other country in the world has anything quite like it. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for the work that you have done and the leadership you have provided as chair of the BBC. You have been a champion for what a strong BBC can achieve, not only for audiences at home, but also for the BBC's contribution to the economy and to the UK's global soft power. I would like to express my gratitude for your work with the government to maintain the BBC World Service in its unrivalled status as the world's largest international broadcaster and supporting its crucial role in tackling harmful disinformation through providing trusted news and analysis globally. I know that you are held in high regard by the BBC board. You have clearly demonstrated your commitment to public service, and I especially applaud the work that you did during the pandemic. Your decision to step down in the wider interests of the corporation is further testament to that commitment. Certainty and stability for the corporation are clearly a shared priority. In this context, I have spoken to the board and they have proposed that you stay in place until the next board meeting on the 27th of June 2023, whilst an acting chair is appointed in line with the Charter. I have accepted this and would like to thank you for your continued service to assist in ensuring an orderly and smooth transition takes place. We will also move to launch a process to identify and appoint a permanent new chair. Thank you once again for your service, and I wish you well for the future. I am sure there will be further opportunities for you to make a significant contribution to public life. That is the Culture Secretary, Lucy Fraser. A letter there to the outgoing chair of the BBC, Richard Sharp, who has resigned in the last 20 minutes. We can go back to Joe Pike in Westminster there. I mean, Joe, this narrative is really taking shape now that Richard Sharp has acted with integrity, that he didn't intentionally do anything wrong and had the full backing of the BBC board.
Interesting, Ian, that Lucy Fraser says she respects his decision as well in that letter that you've just read out. Of course, she partly respects the decision because it makes her life far easier. The Charter states that she would have had a role in firing him. Ultimately, it would be up to her in consultation with the BBC board. And ultimately, I suppose Rishi Sunak would have been the key decision maker here. By deciding to resign, Mr Sharp has made life for both the Culture Secretary and the Prime Minister easier. Yes, there are people who've been supportive of Mr Sharp, as you say. There are many people within the BBC and BBC board who have been supportive. I suppose there was always a sort of balance to be struck here between the ongoing damage of Mr Sharp remaining in that job, the continuing bad headlines that he provoked. Yes, he breached the code. Maybe it wasn't a material breach, but he was involved in some way in this loan being given to Boris Johnson by a rich financier. Now, maybe he wasn't directly involved in it, but certainly the fact he went to the Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case, to warn him about it and to warn him that he wanted to apply for the job as BBC chairman, I think shows that there was a conflict that Mr Sharp recognised that he should have mentioned both to the appointments panel and to the Culture Select Committee. That Select Committee have already reported saying that there was a breach of the standards expected, and Mr Sharp made a significant error of judgment. And more reaction from politicians in the last few minutes. Lucy Powell, who's a Shadow Culture Secretary, has tweeted this: "I have this morning received the report of the investigation to Richard Sharp, which Labour instigated. The report is clear. Mr Sharp breached the rules expected of candidates by failing to disclose his involvement in a personal loan to the then PM. As a result, this breach has caused untold damage to the reputation of the BBC and seriously undermined its independence as a result of the Conservatives' sleaze and cronyism. This comes after 13 years of the Tories doing everything they can to defend themselves and their mates." From Owen Paterson to Dominic Raab, she says, and now Richard Sharp, instead of doing what's best for the country, the PM was more interested in defending his old banking boss. The PM should have sacked him weeks ago. Instead, it took this investigation called by Labour to make him resign. Obviously, Lucy Powell with a pretty political, punchy response as to the different tone struck by the Culture Secretary. She ends, Lucy Powell, by saying, "Rishi Sunak should urgently establish a truly independent and robust process to replace Sharp to help restore some trust in the BBC after his government has tarnished it so badly." Now, of course, Mr Sharp was a Conservative donor, is a Conservative donor, but there have, of course, been, under Labour Prime Ministers, Labour appointees to this key position. It's always been a political position, that of BBC chairman. And therefore, some would argue that Labour need to remember that when they are criticising what has happened here. I'm sure we'll have more reaction in the coming hours, but it does seem pretty clear that Mr. Sharp realises the continuing damaging impact if he were to remain in post. And what could have happened today after the Heppenstall report had appeared if he hadn't resigned was more people, more politicians, more members of the Culture Select Committee asking for him to resign. We could have had difficult TV moments with him being, doorstepped. He has managed to neutralise all of that. This was, I suppose, a decision about his future, but also a carefully thought out communication strategy to sort of kill that story before it blew up. He's decided to resign, but we know he'll stay for 2 more months in that position until an acting chair of the BBC board is appointed.
Thanks, Joe. Well, joining me now is Alex Crowley. He's worked closely with Boris Johnson, including on his Conservative leadership campaign, but he quit as a Downing Street political advisor in September 2019. Alex, thanks for joining me this morning. I mean, I'm reminded in all of this, this whole saga unravelled began when the Sunday Times reported in January of Richard Sharp's involvement in facilitating this loan guarantee. The background to all this, of course, was that around the time the loan was arranged, Boris Johnson was in serious financial difficulties.
Yes, and I think Richard Sharp has been somewhat the victim of Boris's, shall we say, chaotic personal life, which he perhaps didn't ever imagine that it would lead to this. I think it's worth remembering that we use the language about facilitation of a loan and arranging a loan. Of course, it makes him sound like he's a sort of bank manager, when I think in reality, as I think the report today makes clear, is that he set up a meeting to have a discussion about this. And whilst it's entirely right that there was a technical breach of the rules, he should have declared it to the panel who was making this decision. He did not declare it, and therefore it's a breach. And fair enough, he's done the right thing and resigned. We're not talking about some grand conspiracy here, I think.
No, it's quite interesting. I've just been rereading the original Sunday Times report on this from January this year. It did have some extraordinary details in it, saying that Sam Blythe, who was the provider of the loan guarantee, said before the loan was finalised, Johnson, Sharp and Blythe had a private dinner at Chequers, the Prime Minister's grace and favour home in the Chiltern Hills in Buckinghamshire, where, according to a source, they ate chop suey and drank wine. It's an extraordinary way for a sitting Prime Minister to go about business, isn't it?
Yes, look, it's a very unorthodox way, clearly, of going about things, and look, we don't, none of us knows the true state of Boris Johnson's personal finances. We know what clearly he declares as he has to as an MP and what he had to as a Prime Minister. But yes, look, it was a very unusual state of affairs. But he is a very unusual politician in that regard, and ultimately his own kind of chaotic style of doing things and not quite doing things properly ultimately led to his downfall. And so he has paid the price for that. And now it appears, of course, lots of other people are paying the price for that too, including today Richard Sharp.
Absolutely. What do you think the characteristics of the next chair of the BBC are going to likely to have to be? Richard Sharp was in many ways the ideal chair of the BBC. He was well plugged into Conservative circles. Rishi Sunak had worked for him. He's an extremely experienced financier. Just about everything that the BBC really needs as it juggles with these great funding commitments and challenges that it faces.
Yes, look, it's important to remember that this is a political appointment. I don't think we should take any lessons from the Labour Party, who are saying, oh, no, it should be completely apolitical. It should be completely straight down the line. It isn't apolitical. Labour governments have appointed Labour people to this role, just as Conservative governments have done likewise. The key test here is it someone who actually has the gravitas and the authority? It's not, did they donate to the Conservative Party? Do they vote Conservative? Do they vote Labour? It's, are they right for the role? And it's not unreasonable for the Prime Minister of the day to appoint someone that is at least vaguely politically aligned to them. Once you become BBC chairman, of course, you have to follow the rules of the BBC. And of course, as we've seen with Richard Sharp today, there is big public scrutiny and accountability for that role. But there is politics behind all of this. The reason why the people went after Richard Sharp is because they didn't like the fact that Boris had appointed someone who was linked to the Conservative Party. We saw it with the attempt to appoint Paul Dacre as well. There's lots of politics around this. So the next appointment, Rishi Sunak should do it with confidence, pick someone he believes in, and obviously follow the right process.
All right, Alex Rowley, good to talk to you this morning. Appreciate you joining me.
Thank you.
We're just going to remind you of the news that's broken during the last half hour, which is that Richard Sharp, the chairman of the BBC, has resigned. This follows a report by the King's Counsel, Adam Heppenstall, into the circumstances in which Boris Johnson received a loan guarantee in which Richard Sharp was said to have been involved. That was not disclosed during the process to which he was appointed to the BBC. The report says that the breach of any rules was inadvertent and not deliberate, but Richard Sharp has nonetheless decided to resign. We can play you now what Richard Sharp said just a few moments ago.
Good morning. I would like to thank Adam Heppenstall and his team for the diligence and professionalism they have shown in compiling today's report. Mr. Heppenstall's view is that while I did breach the governance code for public appointments, he states very clearly that a breach does not necessarily invalidate an appointment. Indeed, I've always maintained the breach was inadvertent and not material, which the facts he lays out substantiate. The Secretary of State has consulted with the BBC board, who support that view. Nevertheless, I have decided that it is right to prioritise the interest of the BBC. I feel that this matter may well be a distraction from the corporation's good work were I to remain in post until the end of my term. I have, therefore, this morning, resigned as the BBC chair to the Secretary of State and to the board. It was proposed to me that I stay on as chair until the end of June, while the process to appoint my successor is undertaken, and I will, of course, do that in the interests of the corporation's stability and continuity. Let me turn to the events that are subject of today's report. When I sought in December 2020 to introduce the Cabinet Secretary to Mr. Blythe, I did so in good faith. I did so with the best of intentions, and I did so with the sole purpose of ensuring that all relevant rules were being followed. I am pleased that Mr. Heppenstall supports the fact that my involvement in these matters, as he states, was accordingly very limited. After extensive work, he states, his words, that he is happy to record that he has seen no evidence, and nor could he, to say I played any part whatsoever in facilitation, arrangement, or financing of a loan to the former Prime Minister. Now, during my conversation with the Cabinet Secretary on December the 4th, 2020, I reminded him of the fact that I was in the BBC appointment process. I believed, as a result of that conversation, that I had been removed from any conflict or perception of conflict. I understood this recusal to be absolute. This was my error. In my subsequent interview with the appointments panel, I wish, with the benefit of hindsight, this potential perceived conflict of interest was something I had considered to mention. I would like once again to apologise for that oversight, inadvertent though it was, and for the distraction these events have caused the BBC. For more than 20 years, I've devoted time and energy to public service, whether at the Institute of Cancer Research, at the Royal Academy of Arts, on the Financial Policy Committee of the Bank of England, or as an economic advisor to the Treasury working up to protect British business, including the creative industries, during the pandemic. And for more than 2 years now, I've seen the beating heart of the BBC up close. And for all its complexities, successes, and occasional failings, the BBC is an incredible, dynamic, and world-beating creative force, unmatched anywhere. As chair, I have acted at all times in the public interest and for the betterment of the BBC. I'm proud to have fought for the recent return of government funding for the World Service. I've been active in commissioning independent thematic reviews of BBC coverage on touchstone issues, and I've championed the importance of the BBC as a well-funded and impartial public service broadcaster. To chair this incredible organisation has been an honour. The BBC's contribution to our national life is immense. Its people are hardworking and absolutely brilliant, and preserving and enhancing it really matters. Thank you.
So that was Richard Sharp's resignation statement. In the last half hour, they're resigning over the publication of a report that suggested he inadvertently breached rules during the appointment process to his becoming the chairman of the BBC. That report, of course, by Adam Heppenstall, KC. Ali Fortescue's been looking at that report while we've been on air. Ali, anything else struck you in the last few minutes?
Yeah, so we've got the report, 25 pages long. We've been going through it. You can see we've got a new little bit here. Obviously, this is all about what did Richard Sharp tell to the panel that was interviewing him when he was going for the job of BBC chairman. Here we go. It may well have been a reasonable conversation in the context of Mr. Sharp's role as special advisor, but failing to mention it to the panel does amount to a failure to disclose a potential perceived conflict of interest. So there's a potential perceived conflict of interest. Obviously, that is right at the heart of this. This is all about the loan guarantee that Richard Sharp helped Boris Johnson with. It goes on to say, whilst it might have been appropriate for Mr. Sharp to inform his boss of his application, particularly in light of Mr. Sharp's work at a time of national emergency, it was also appropriate for him to have informed the panel of the conversation. So Richard Sharp should have told the panel that was interviewing him about this conversation that he'd had, about this loan guarantee that he'd helped Boris Johnson with. We do know that he told the Cabinet Secretary, but if we go back a few pages, here we go. And this is all about how Number 10 was helping push, really, for Richard Sharp to get the job at the time. We know the job of BBC chairman is something that the Prime Minister has a say in. Number 10 commented to DCMS, Culture, Media and Sport Department, on the 26th of November 2020 that Mr. Sharp looked like a strong candidate. And it goes on to say, Number 10's support for Richard Sharp was made known to the panel, that he was the only candidate identified to the panel as having his candidacy supported by ministers. So there you go, a perceived conflict of interest. We know now that Richard Sharp has stepped down as chairman of the BBC, and we will, of course, keep looking through the fine print in this document and let you know if we find anything more interesting, Ian.
All right, thanks, Ali. We can go back to Joe Pike in Westminster as well. I mean, Joe, give me some thoughts on how Rishi Sunak emerges from all of this, because this report came out, first of all, in the Sunday Times in late January. By mid-February, a lot of media grandees, the likes of Jonathan Dimbleby, former BBC presenter, Chris Patton, a former chairman of the BBC, of course, all of them indicating that they felt that Richard Sharp should stand down. And throughout that process, Rishi Sunak said, no, we must wait for the independent report from Adam Heppenstall to give his conclusions. Does Rishi Sunak in any way emerge slightly weaker from having sort of waited for process to take its course here?
It's a really interesting question, Ian. Certainly the Prime Minister has tried to keep far away from the TV cameras on this topic and out of the headlines, a bit like this time last week when we were talking about Dominic Raab resigning. We didn't see Rishi Sunak on camera for quite some time, clearly wanting to keep away from the front line when bad headlines hit, although he will be at the Scottish Conservative Conference in Scotland today and in Wales for the Welsh Conservative Conference, so we may hear a little bit more from him. Yes, I suppose this is partly damaging because we know that Richard Sharp is a friend of Rishi Sunak, a former boss, a former colleague at Goldman Sachs. Ultimately, though, Rishi Sunak faces this sort of small crisis, I suppose you could call it, bad headlines, because of one of his predecessors, yet again, Boris Johnson, and in this case his finances, is causing problems for Rishi Sunak. Now, of course, Boris Johnson's attitude towards standards has caused trouble with the Standards Committee investigation, Privileges Committee investigation into what Boris Johnson told Parliament. That is something very difficult for Rishi Sunak to deal with. This is something similar, I suppose, because if Boris Johnson hadn't been in such a difficult financial position, Sam Blythe wouldn't have seen that in the newspapers, wanted to do something, approach Richard Sharp. Sharp, which led to this whole thing kicking off. There are still questions about who was providing financial support to Boris Johnson while he was Prime Minister. Certainly a lack of clarity there, but I don't think we're going to get much more clarity on it. Certainly allies of that former Prime Minister saying it's not in the public interest for there to be any more transparency on that. Meanwhile, one big question is what does happen with the appointment process. Certainly Labour haven't yet called for this to be a non-political appointment, to be handled completely independently, but we do know they've appointed an independent BBC review panel to look into all of this and look at that issue. So it's possible when that reports Labour policy could change, and therefore if they're in a government in 18 months' time or so, we could see that change. I think it's perhaps unlikely to change before the acting chair is appointed in 2 months' time, and therefore before the appointment process for a permanent BBC chair kicks off. Certainly, I think there'll be a huge amount of media interest in that. And actually, in the report, Mr. Heppenstall seems critical of the fact that so much of that process seems to have been played in the public sphere, saying this: leaks and briefings to the press of preferred candidates should be prohibited by ministers. If this does happen, then mitigating steps should be considered. Also interesting on that point that Mr. Sharp says his breach of the rules was inadvertent. That was a key sort of message in that statement he delivered at the BBC today. Worth noting that the KC, Mr. Heppenstall, doesn't comment on that. He says, Mr. Sharp has stated to me that if there was a failure to disclose a conflict, it was inadvertent. As noted elsewhere in this report, it's not for me to form a judgment on Mr. Sharp's conduct. So Mr. Heppenstall not agreeing or disagreeing with that, even though that is a key sort of communication line for the now outgoing BBC chairman. Yes, I think, Ian, it's going to be more damaging for Rishi Sunak if Mr. Sharp hadn't resigned, but by acting quickly, even before the report was published, I think he's probably saved his former Goldman Sachs colleague from a particularly difficult day in front of the TV cameras in Scotland and Wales.
Yeah, Joe, is there an opportunity perhaps for Rishi Sunak to try and depoliticise the role of BBC chairman? As Alex Crowley was saying to me earlier on this morning, this has always been a political role. Labour governments appointed people like Michael Lyons and Gavin Davis, both of whom were Labour supporters, to the role of chairman. The Conservatives have likewise done similarly with Chris Patton and now obviously with Richard Sharp. Is this an opportunity to once and for all depoliticise this, as Labour seem to be suggesting?
It is an opportunity, but there are those who argue within government that the BBC has a very big funding settlement via the licence fee payers, and it is completely reasonable that the government of the day, democratically elected government, does have some sort of oversight of that through this role. Now, the role of BBC chairman isn't a sort of a day-to-day management role. Ultimately, Tim Davie and his team, Tim Davie, the Director General, and his team are managing the corporation day-to-day. And some would argue this sort of oversight role with some sort of government link is completely fair, especially since it's licence fee payers who are funding the corporation, and the government is democratically elected by them. But I think the fact there have been so many bad headlines in the last 3 months over Richard Sharp's links to the Conservative Party as a donor, but also as somebody who played some, even small role in trying to sort out Boris Johnson's finances, that doesn't look good. And you could completely see in the future another political appointment causing similar problems. I think what it means, even if there isn't a depoliticisation of this role, what it means is that the appointment process for the next person has got to be incredibly rigorous. It's going to be a tough process, both the appointments panel and the evidence that the sort of final nominee will give to the Culture Select Committee. That may indeed put off some potential applicants if it looks like such a sort of a poison chalice. If it looks too difficult, it may potentially put off some really talented applicants. But now the search is underway for an acting chair. They'll take over on the 27th of June, and the process will begin to appoint a new person to this role of BBC chairman. And it is well paid, Ian, £160,000 a year.
OK, thanks, Joe. Joining me now is the Conservative peer, Lord Moylan, the former advisor to Boris Johnson. Lord Moylan, welcome to you. I mean, the consensus seems to be emerging that actually Richard Sharp, whatever he did wrong was inadvertent. He's acted with integrity by going in the way that he has done. Isn't this just really evidence that anyone, who comes into Boris Johnson, ultimately their reputation gets contaminated?
My reputation hasn't been contaminated. I'd give you a list of at least 100 people who've worked with Boris Johnson whose reputation I know from personal knowledge hasn't been contaminated. I think that's a preposterous thing to say. This was a small administrative error. I think Mr. Sharp, whom I don't know, and of course I haven't read the report in full because it's only just been published. So with those caveats, Mr. Sharp appears to have disclosed what might be a conflict of interest to the cabinet secretary and thought that he was fulfilling the rules by doing that. It's been found that he didn't fulfill the rules by doing that. That wasn't quite enough. And very honorably, I think we've all agreed, he stood down as a result of being found to have made that modest breach. I don't actually see how this engages Boris Johnson at all, actually.
Well, it does, because Boris Johnson, it was his financial difficulties and the fact that he needed
you can go
money.
back in history. You could say, well, what was the interest? The question at issue here was, did Mr. Sharp have an interest that he should have declared to the panel? It doesn't matter what the history of that interest was. And what has been found out, what it's been said of him, is that he should have declared it. He thought he'd done that effectively. All right, muddle. And nobody thinks he was being dishonest at all. He thought he had declared it. It doesn't matter what it was. It could have been his grandmother's interest in azaleas if it was relevant to the job. I don't see why there's any need to bring Boris Johnson into this at all. The Prime Minister
you do need to bring
always
Boris Johnson into it. This whole
sort of
saga has unfolded because Boris Johnson in late 2020 needed a loan of £800,000. I mean, that's not Richard Sharp's fault.
Well, all right. As I say, you can go into the history of what led to the conflict of interest. That's not about what today's report is about. What today's report about is, did he have a conflict of interest which he should have declared? And it was found that he didn't, and he's behaved very responsibly in going, although that is, he didn't declare it, although he thought he had. And that's really, as far as I can tell, is the long and the short of this whole quite expensive report. So there was a conflict of interest, and it was to do with Boris. The idea that everybody's reputation, who's connected with Boris, is destroyed is complete nonsense, or this isn't even really a story about Boris. There are stories, there are things you might want to ask about Boris and finances. I don't know the answers to them. They've got nothing to do with Richard Sharp or the BBC.
Well, Lord Moylan, apologies for any imputation on that suggested that your reputation was tarnished by
that's very, and you seem to be suggesting straight off that my reputation had been tarnished. Why would you have me on your show if I had such a bad reputation?
No, absolutely not. We're not implying there's been any damage, but it is a fact nonetheless that a lot of people who do come into Boris Johnson and to contact with him, their reputation ends up being damaged in some way. And Richard Sharp is really the latest example of that.
Well, maybe that's because there are people in Britain who want to eradicate Boris Johnson's memory, and they go for people near him. Very much as you have these attacks on Trump at the moment in America. I'm not saying there's any similarity between Trump and Boris, because 5 minutes intelligent reflection shows that there isn't. But it's simply a technique that seems to be growing, particularly on the left, is to use courts and smears and so on to keep going at somebody even after they've stood down.
Lord Moylan, before I let you go, I mean, this really does appear to be the job from hell. I mean, you're in the political spotlight throughout. Who on earth would want this job? Who on earth would want to succeed Richard Sharp?
I think it's a really, really good question. And I don't think it's just BBC jobs. I think these high-profile chairmanships, where you get somebody who has real business experience, who doesn't come from a political background, who isn't used to being abused on Twitter the whole time and whatever, but they come out of a world of business and finance experience, and they have a lot to give in these roles. And then they discover the sort of battering they get and the publicity they've been subjected to. Not just Richard Sharp. I think of other people. There was the man who was chairing the Environment Agency at the time of the flooding in the Somerset Levels, whose reputation was totally trashed because he was on his Christmas holiday. He was a very senior and significant engineer who'd taken that job. I think it's really difficult to persuade people to do it because of the potential for exposure and having your whole family laughed at and having your reputation ridiculed, not because you've done a bad job, but because of something related to a headline. You never dare take a holiday because if something goes wrong and you're photographed on a beach, you're sort of trashed. So I think it really is difficult. But I think it's really important for the BBC to have somebody as chairman who is their friend in government. You know, people write about this as if a Conservative comes in anywhere into the ambit of the BBC administration, they're there as a sort of Attila the Hun coming to destroy it, whereas nearly all of them actually are there to be the BBC's, they turn out to be the BBC's friend at the heart of government. And if you cut yourself off completely into a wholly political sphere, you won't have any friends at part of government.
Yeah. Lord Moylan, greatly appreciate you joining me this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian.
This is the scene outside New Broadcasting House at the moment. We'll keep tabs on what's going on there. But in the meantime, back to Ali Fortescue in Westminster. Ali, you've been scouring the report from Adam Heppenstall over the last hour. What more can you tell us?
Hello. Yes. Right. Let's just get to some of the best bits in this, or the most interesting bits in this 25-page report. Here you go. The successful candidate, Mr. Richard Sharp, failed to disclose potential perceived conflicts of interest to the panel. That goes right to the heart of this. What did Richard Sharp tell the panel for the interview at the BBC board? Mr. Sharp informed the Prime Minister he wished to apply for the chair of the BBC board. That was one of the areas where he went wrong. And secondly, Mr. Sharp also informed the former Prime Minister he was going to meet with the Cabinet Secretary to attempt to introduce him to a person who might assist him with his personal finances. This is all about that loan guarantee that Richard Sharp helped Boris Johnson with by setting him up with a distant relative. These matters gave rise, here you go, to a potential conflict of interest. There is a risk of a perception that Mr. Sharp was recommended for appointment because he assisted the former Prime Minister in a private financial matter, and or that he influenced the former Prime Minister to recommend him by informing him of his application before he submitted it. So that, there you go, a breach of the governance code. You can see there, that is what it comes down to. That is what Richard Sharp mentioned in that interview this morning. He does go on to say, though, in this report that a breach of the governance code does not invalidate the appointment. That was something that Richard Sharp touched on as well in his interview, but he has still decided to go. And I just want to show you one more bit very quickly, if we have time, here. This is all about the pressure, really, that Number 10 was putting on giving Richard Sharp that job of BBC chairman. Of course, the Prime Minister does play a role in that. It was very clear that after speaking to Boris Johnson, after helping him with that loan guarantee, he was a preferred candidate. Number 10 commented to the Department of Culture, Media and Sport in November 2020 that Mr. Sharp looked like a strong candidate. Goes on to say, Number 10's support for Richard Sharp was made known to the panel. He was the only candidate identified to the panel as having his candidacy supported by ministers. Well, there you go. After a long wait, we have this 25-page report making clear that Richard Sharp, there was a perceived conflict of interest. Richard Sharp did breach the rules. We know now, obviously, that he has decided to go.
All right, thanks very much for that, Ali. We can go back to Joe Pike in Westminster, our political correspondent. Joe, any early runners and riders being talked about?
Not yet, Ian, but if you know of any, let me know. We'll be interested to talk to them because it does sound like a bit of a difficult process. I'm sure it will be one with a lot of media attention to replace Richard Sharp. There has been some more political reaction, this time from Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats. Both the Lib Dems and Labour, I think, trying to use this moment for their political advantage. Perhaps no surprise with local elections in England just 6 days away. This is what Ed Davey has said on Twitter. The BBC is being dragged through the mud by the Conservative Party after yet another sleaze scandal. Everything these Conservative politicians touch turns into a mess. They're not fit to govern our great country. Earlier we heard from Lucy Powell, the Shadow Culture Secretary. He's been leading for Labour on this story, saying that from Owen Paterson to Dominic Raab and now Richard Sharp, instead of doing what's best for the country, the PM is more interested in defending his old banking boss. We should point out that Rishi Sunak was asked about Richard Sharp when he visited San Diego. He was asked by our very own Sam Coates, and he didn't defend Mr. Sharp. He didn't take the opportunity to defend him. So I'm not sure Lucy Powell's entirely right saying that Rishi Sunak has defended his old banking boss, but she says the PM should have sacked him weeks ago, instead took this investigation called by Labour to make him resign. Yes, Rishi Sunak is, I suppose, a friend of Richard, former Goldman Sachs colleague, but he was appointed to BBC chairman under the premiership of Boris Johnson. And in fact, this whole row, as we know, Ian, happened because of Boris Johnson's finances, or maybe rather the lack of those finances. Mr. Sharp did breach the rules. The Heppenstall report is very clear about that. Yes, that doesn't invalidate his appointment. He could have tried to stay, although I think it would have been a pretty difficult situation. There would have been increasing calls for him to go. Yes, Richard Sharp argues that breach of the rules, not notifying both the appointments panel and the Culture Select Committee about his role in this loan, that was, he says, an inadvertent breach. The KC in this isn't commenting on that, isn't agreeing or disagreeing, but I think perhaps it was inevitable that Richard Sharp would have to go, considering there have been 3 months of very bad headlines, bad damaging headlines for the corporation. It always was a balance. It was the leadership of the BBC board by Mr. Sharp so good, so much better than a potential successor, that he should stay, over the sort of reputational damage to the BBC every time a different headline appeared. And of course, the Sunday Times first reported this in late January, so it has been quite some time of bad headlines. He is off. He's no longer the BBC chair.
OK, Joe, thanks for that. Just a reminder of what's happened during the last hour. Richard Sharp has resigned as chairman of the BBC. I'm back on Tuesday with the business news. In the meantime, on my interview with Alison Rose from NatWest will be on our digital platform soon. See you Tuesday. Cheerio.